Well, thank you for being here. My name's Tasha. I'm a PhD student at the University of Birmingham. I'm funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, or the AHRC. My PhD project focuses on the queer literature of politically active female authors between 1882 and 1914. So nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to give a bit of a rundown of a project I worked on as part of a placement programme with the Birmingham Museums Trust. The AHRC funded me to take a 3-month break from my PhD in order to pursue this, so it stands alone as a short-term project separate from my doctoral studies. So I'll begin with telling you a little bit about the project itself, the aims, the outputs, and the limitations. Firstly, the project aimed to go through as many of the collections I could and identify any object of queer significance. The Birmingham Museums Trust has over 1 million objects, so this is obviously an incomplete project and needs ongoing work. So in order to find objects, I had to do background research to know what to search for in the databases, and this involved a lot of digging around for hidden references and notes regarding the queerness of certain objects and people. Some objects had missing information, so for those I also provided suggestions on how to fill in the blanks, so to speak, for things like dates and object descriptions. And at the end of the 3 months, I'd put together 3 things. The first was a 70-page reference guide with all the research into the objects I'd selected. This is where most of my research ended up. I split it into 4 categories. The first section was queer artists and their work. This is the biggest section, and this ascends in chronological order, beginning with Albrecht Dürer in the 15th century, all the way to David Hockney and Matt Smith, who, to my knowledge, are both still alive today. My next section was on queer subjects, so this included things like the ancient Greeks and St. Sebastian and people associated with queerness in some way, rather than being artists themselves. So I had sketches relating to Walt Whitman and Havelock Ellis. The final 2 sections of this reference guide were much smaller. They looked into different art schools such as aestheticism, the Pre-Raphaelites, that lend themselves to queer interpretation, and then kind of miscellaneous objects that were quite difficult to position anywhere else. For instance, one of the objects in this last category is an LGBT pride badge from the Commonwealth Games. So this has a lot of stuff that it doesn't quite neatly go into artist or created. The purpose of this guide was so that in the future, if somebody was curating an exhibition and they came across one of these objects, they could have a look at my guide and kind of have a jumping off point for the research that they were to do. I also completed a survey of significance detailing why these objects were important and a spreadsheet with information on all 176 objects I selected, such as dates, acquisition details, etc. For this project, there were, of course, numerous limitations. The online database the museum works with to catalogue the objects often had insufficient tagging, meaning objects of queer significance wouldn't come up with a quick and easy search. Another limitation was my own lack of knowledge. My background means that my knowledge base was set firmly in the 19th century, and particularly in the fine art collections. Most scholarship I could find about queer history was also situated in fine arts, meaning that this is potentially an oversaturated section. Whether that's because there's more tangible objects in fine art or because we just know that it's there, I'm not sure, but it's something worth considering. A lot of the objects and collections like science and industry also weren't collected with any kind of reference to the people who used or donated or invented specific objects. These collections are therefore potentially underrepresented. But again, as to whether this is based on whether it's there or not, or it's just more difficult to ascertain, is uncertain. Another limitation is the idea of a queer collection in itself, because in order to identify what is queer, I had to first define the parameters of queerness within which I wanted to work. And as anyone who has worked in queer theory will know, that's something that's quite difficult to do. So I'll just take a moment to explain the approach that I took. Firstly, I used the word queer in this presentation and this project and my PhD as well, because it's a really helpful word that encompasses the breadth of all experiences that are not cisgender heterosexual. I'm aware it's a contentious word with a long and turbulent history, but it is the currently accepted academic term, so that is why I'm using it. I defined queerness in a couple of different ways across this project, depending on my needs. For example, starting with artists who we know for certain engaged in sexual relationships with people of the same gender. That seems pretty a decent place to start. But then certain objects have queer afterlives and are relevant to queer experience without being necessarily queer themselves. And this is where we get into, for example, Henry Scott Duke. These required slightly different interpretations of queerness and their usages. My main viewpoint when it comes to defining queerness is, perhaps annoyingly, that it resists definition. I was influenced by scholars like Anna Clark, Lee Edelman, and Richard Kay when defining my use of queer, and I've put a quote up here from Kay that I think summarises the perspective I went for really well. He views queerness as an unstable and shifting thing, constantly being defined and redefined. For instance, prior to the late 1890s, the idea of a homosexual or queer identity didn't really exist. It wasn't until Havelock Ellis and other such scholars, other sexologists, presented this idea that it really took hold. So that opens up a bunch of questions about whether a gay person could have existed prior to this. The short answer is yes, but their understanding of their own identity was likely very different to what we have today. So that's just something we have to bear in mind when studying the past. With this said, I'd like to emphasise that I don't aim to categorise people from the past with our 21st century understandings of queerness and identity-focused queerness. If terms such as gay, lesbian, bisexual and transgender are used, it's with the understanding that these are terms that would not have been in use, certainly at the points in time I'm focusing on in this paper. Chris Reed and Richard Sandell, in their very helpful literature review of queer work in museums, present that by acknowledging the spectrum on which gender identity and sexuality exists, queer allows for the inclusion of those individuals, both past and present, whose identities cannot be articulated through labels. And so by using the term queer, we can try to be a little bit more inclusive rather than categorise things into distinct labels that have the tendency to be a little bit slippery. It therefore becomes possible to expand our understanding of the queer and craft a multifaceted view of queer heritage with the appropriate breadth. Queer work into museum collections is a relatively recent development. Organisations such as the Queer Heritage and Collections Network are supporting vital work in this area in galleries, archives, libraries and museums across the country. A 2021 survey by Aran Rees indicated that around 53% of participants, most of whom were museum professionals who already had an interest in queer heritage, used queer-related terms in their cataloguing system. However, not all queer heritage projects undertaken by museums result in queer cataloguing. The survey suggested that only 32% of participants claimed to have recorded insights from a queer heritage project in their data management systems. This clearly shows there's plenty of work to be done in museums to ensure that queer cataloguing becomes a more common practice. What Rees also highlights is that the act of queering doesn't have to relate solely to LGBTQ+ people. It should be intertwined with other projects such as decolonisation. He argues that we should avoid letting queer heritage projects becoming something that are only pursued by queer people and should instead be embedded across all museum work. We want to avoid pigeonholing people into only working on their sector of the humanities. Intersectionality across all areas is important. So here's a lovely chart for you. I said a moment ago that fine art was quite overrepresented because of my own area of knowledge, and the scholarship that's available largely focuses on this. And you can clearly see that this is represented in the percentage of objects I discovered from the fine art collections. 103 of my 176 objects, or around 59%, were from the fine art collections. This is followed by applied art, which includes things like jewellery, stained glass, with only 24 objects. The categories only get smaller from here, with antiquities, topographical views, and science and industry taking up smaller and smaller percentages of my selected objects. The big surprise for me was social history. I expected to find more in the social history collection than I did. Social history is a massive collection, but it's really hard to sift through, and that is represented in the fact that I found only 22 objects there. There were some really lovely things in social history that I can't show you due to copyright. There were handmade protest signs from a protest in Birmingham in 2017, a really lovely wedding invitation from a couple called Kevin and Brian, who as I have ascertained through some like Google stalking, they appear to still be together about 20 years later. So that's really, really fun. Down at the bottom, with only one object each, is oral history and numismatics, which is coins and medals. Just because these collections had only one object each, though, doesn't mean that they're less worthy of attention. The oral history interview, for example, was really, really interesting. It's about three men who grew up in the 20th century in Birmingham. They discuss their experiences living here in the 70s. And it really puts a lot of things into focus, especially for me as someone who grew up in a very different and potentially far more accepting Birmingham to those people of an older generation, perhaps. So now onto themes. You see that it's a little more evenly divided. Many objects I chose to categorise fall across more than one theme, so this chart doesn't really easily map onto the 176 objects in the same way that the collections chart did. But the main issue, as you can see, is that the collection is overwhelmingly white male. Over a quarter of the objects I selected were created by queer white men at 31%. On this chart, it looks a little bit lower because, like I said, objects were in multiple categories. So it's 24% of the total themes were made by queer white men, but it works out as 31% of the 176 objects, while only 6% are created by queer women. Furthermore, only 16 objects, or 9%, have non-white origins, 9 of which are works by non-white artists. 12 works in the collection, or 7%, are completed by Jewish people, 11 which are completed by Simeon Solomon, and the other is by Gluck, which I believe is on display in the council house still. I tentatively did not include these Jewish people in the non-white category, as both Solomon and Gluck were from families who immigrated from Europe. However, it's important to note that Jewish people in England in the 19th century and the 20th century would have been treated as racial others, and often still are. So there's clearly still work to be done to diversify the queer collections, to even them out a bit more, whether this is seeking out a kind of reparative heritage in finding other objects by non-white creators, or with non-white origins that show a queer perspective, or by working with artists and collaborators in the future to improve this going forward. I don't know. But either way, it's work that is important to ensure that the collections represent the communities they serve. So next up, I'm going to show you some objects that I selected from my project to go into a little bit more detail on. Just to note, because of the limitations of copyright and Birmingham's digital archives, I can only show you these 4, which are all from fine art and from the 19th and early 20th century. I'm aware that I've been saying over and over again that fine art is overrepresented, and unfortunately it will continue to be overrepresented for the remainder of the presentation, just because that's the way it worked out with the objects that were available on the digital archives. So we'll start the very same place I did for my project, with Simeon Solomon. Solomon's a really important artist in the Birmingham collections because, as I'm sure many of you are aware, Birmingham has the largest collection of pre-Raphaelite paintings in the world, and Solomon was one of the last artists working in this movement. He was a very popular artist in his time. His work was exhibited at the Royal Academy many, many times, but he fell out of favour in 1873 when he faced charges of gross indecency, which was, at the time, the name for the charge for sex with other men. We know for a fact he was a queer artist and that his queerness was often something included in his work. The painting I've selected here is one of my favourites. It's called A Saint of the Eastern Church. It depicts a masculine figure, but the facial features and the long hair are less clearly masculine. Solomon had a preference for a kind of gender neutrality in his work. He believed that an androgynous expression of gender was more spiritual and therefore more perfect. This is something we see across most of his paintings and drawings. He likes to depict men with feminine features and women with masculine features. And for Solomon, this is a kind of representation of a perfect spirituality. But perhaps you disagree that this painting is androgynous, but I assure you it's not just me saying that. Reviewers at the time that this was painted in 1868 also noted this. For instance, the reviewer for the Athenaeum, which is a periodical popular with aesthetes like Oscar Wilde, wrote that this painting too obviously lacks manliness to be praised. Colin Crews also notes that the gender presentation here is stylized to reflect Solomon's own gender ideal, the blending of masculinity and femininity in a way that represents this ideal spirituality. And just to add to this, These are two head studies from the collection, which I thought were good examples of Solomon's androgyny. The one on the left is titled Head of a Woman. But as you can see, she has those pre-Raphaelite masculine features like a square jaw, strong eyebrows, etc. She's also got quite low cut drapery around the chest, but we don't see much of this chest, and the hair on her head is in this kind of in-between length between short and long. I'm not at all saying that these are features that are only present in men, just that their usage here tips this towards the androgynous, which was, of course, what we know that Simeon Solomon liked to do. This drawing on the right doesn't have a gender in the title. As we can see, some of the features are quite similar to the one on the left, such as the nose and the lips. It's up to us as the viewer to gender this, and I believe Solomon would have us gender something like this as neutral rather than masculine or feminine. So the next painting I've selected is this Ethel Walker painting. Walker was a Scottish painter, and we now widely understand her as a lesbian artist. Another work of hers in the collection is a nude study. She had preference for painting female nudes and female sitters. The nude is unfortunately not available in digital archives, so I can't show it today. Her work spans many, many styles and subjects, but she consistently returned to painting women in an impressionist adjacent style. This oil painting is not particularly erotically charged or anything, but Walker's status as one of only a handful of queer female artists from the collection means that her work offers an important case study. Walker was a really successful artist in her time. She was the first female member of the New English Art Club. Her work was displayed at the Royal Academy a bunch of times. After her death in 1951, the Tate organised a massive retrospective exhibition that included her contemporaries Gwen John, who also has a place in the selection, and Frances Hodgkins. Unfortunately, after her death, Walker's influence diminished quite significantly, and some scholars, such as Emmanuel Cooper and Helen Rickett, have suggested that this was potentially due to the portrayal of female sexuality and same-sex desire in her work. So the next object is a chalk portrait of Edith Cooper by Charles Shannon. This is a particularly important example from the collections, as it is both sketched by and depicts a queer person. The portrait is dated between 1910 and 1900, so within about a decade of Cooper's death in 1913. Cooper, for those of you who don't know, was one half of the lesbian aunt-niece duo that made up the aesthetic poet Michael Field. Alongside her aunt, Catherine Bradley, Cooper penned some of the quintessential poetic works of the 19th century's aesthetic movement. The poems written by the couple, many of which were passionate love ballads, received critical success, but much of their acclaim only came after their identity was revealed to the public by Robert Browning. So the subject is verifiably queer. We know that Edith and Catherine were in some kind of romantic relationship, but we also know that the artist was queer. Shannon met his lifelong partner, Charles Ricketts, as a teenager, and they lived together for over 5 decades until Ricketts' death in 1931. The two couples lived near one another and were very good friends. Another work in the collection is a painting by Ricketts that was commissioned by Bradley and Cooper and then bequeathed directly to the Birmingham Museums Trust on Bradley's death in 1914. And this is that painting. It's called Tobias and the Angel. I won't linger on this one for too long. As you can see here, it's quite a dark painting, so the contact between these two figures down at the bottom is a little bit obscured. There's some kind of physical contact going on there. We don't have the details of the commission from Bradley and Cooper, but I see quite an intimate, potentially queer moment here between these two figures, especially compared to other paintings depicting this story of Tobias and the Angel. This is quite somber and reserved. They're often quite bright paintings. It doesn't show the actual story of the angel appearing. It only shows this moment of connection between them. So next is this sculpture. This depicts the Birmingham novelist John Hampson. He was apparently famous for his quite distinctive appearance, which you can see is quite well captured in the sculpture. He was a social realist writer, best known for his 1931 novel called Saturday Night at the Greyhound. Maybe some of you have heard of it. He worked with Virginia Woolf and her husband at Hogarth Press, and he achieved a fairly modest success. His earliest manuscript, which Woolf claimed was his best, remained unpublished due to its explicitly, in the words of Woolf, explicitly sodomitical subject matter. Not much is known about Hampson's life, but as a Birmingham local, I felt he was important to include. We don't have much specific information about his sexuality, unfortunately. I didn't come across anything about him having any lovers. If he did, he was very secretive about it, owing to the time. He did marry a German actress, but this was so she could escape Nazi Germany. She left and returned home after World War II. It seems to very clearly have been a marriage of necessity rather than love. But having said that, most people who know about him or knew about him refer to him as a gay writer, so it may have been something of an open secret, especially considering that first manuscript that Woolf really loved but didn't feel able to publish due to its explicit queerness. Of course, we have to remember this was in the 1920s and 30s. It's a time when homosexuality was still illegal and had to be kept firmly under wraps. So, having said all that, the collection can obviously not be considered complete. It underrepresents several groups, including but not limited to queer women, lesbians, queer people of colour, transgender and non-binary people. When these groups are represented in the collection, it's more frequently completed by an individual who does not fall into the categories of these groups, such as men depicting queer women or white people depicting queer people of colour. Ultimately, the number of objects I discovered is quite small. The collection contains over 1 million objects and I found only 176. So there's certainly more in the collection that I was unable to uncover in the short time I had. I'm hoping that if in the future people have a mind to consider queer possibilities, they might stumble upon other objects that have been missed without even looking for them, maybe. Queerness exists in every culture, in every area of humanity, but the overwhelming kind of representation available in these collections is that of white men. This is in part to be expected due to the dominance white men have typically exhibited in artistic circles throughout Britain's history. If women and people of colour did partake in these careers, they often struggled to gain the same level of artistic education and fame as the white men. Income and cultural inequalities also potentially meant that people of colour and women might have struggled to earn a living through the arts in the same way that white men did. For instance, at the Royal Academy, the best place to be positioned in exhibitions that were filled floor to ceiling with paintings was at eye level. And this was a spot reserved mostly for those with specific connections. Women and people of colour would have had to fight significantly harder in order to earn those quality spaces that would enable them to sell their work for more money or earn themselves a higher paying patron. I'm mentioning this just to say that the presence of white men in the collection isn't necessarily a bad thing or an oversight. It's likely just a reflection of the culture of the past. Going forward, however, we must make an effort to equalise the collections. Now, I'm not an expert in museums at all. I was only there for 3 months. I'm not an expert on curation either. But I was asked to make suggestions in my survey of significance. So improvements that I believe could be made to the museum's queer heritage work include more comprehensive inclusivity training for staff in line with the Queer Heritage and Collection Network's Good Practice Guide, and a special effort made towards collecting queer work with a particular focus on queer people of colour, queer women and transgender and non-binary people, all of whom are currently underrepresented in the collections. Improvements to the cataloguing system that allows queer objects or objects with any kind of queer significance to be marked as such would also not be amiss. And this could also be used to highlight other things, such as colonial influence. I also believe an increased level of attention toward personal stories in collections other than fine art and social history would be beneficial, but this is kind of difficult to do on a reparative level. The museum has had a handful of queer exhibitions in the past. My favourite is Matt Smith's Queering the Museum event back in 2010, but I was just 14, so I didn't get to go, unfortunately. What this did really well was invoke the process of queering in a way that was both accessible and challenging. The event was entirely free and objects were placed around the museum and marked with a green carnation, which I'm sure many of you know was a notable queer symbol from the 19th century. Meaning that not only would people interested in queer heritage end up seeing these objects, but they'd be visible to everyone. A particular queer heritage event in a separate space, on the other hand, might have had a more limited interaction. Doing it in the way that Smith did meant that every single person who walked into the museum over that, I think it was a 2-week period, would have engaged with queer art and queer heritage in some way. This is something that can be done on a daily basis in the museum. Object descriptions could easily be changed to include information on queer artists or reference the queer afterlife of an object. As for expanding the collections, Working with a range of people is important to ensure that displays may be helpful and inclusive, but nuance is important with this, as unpaid groups without museum experience may not be as helpful as groups already working within the industry. Nonetheless, multiple perspectives are necessary. Co-production with artists is important to maintain an equal and reciprocal relationship that runs smoothly throughout the production process. It's important to bear in mind that completing projects with queer groups is much more impactful and effective than doing queer work on their behalf. I'll just put up my little bibliography while I finish. This project was loads of fun. I really learned a lot. I'm obviously really grateful to the Arts and Humanities Research Council for funding this, and for the people I worked with at BMT for helping me along the way. I hope this has been thought-provoking and interesting, and I'm of course happy to answer questions and facilitate discussions. Like I said, I work in Victorian literature, so I can do my best to answer specific museum-related questions, but it's not necessarily my area of expertise. My socials are here if you're interested. Thank you very much for listening.